Hello. Well, welcome. And it's really good to see so many people in a room now. For it's been since 2019. I've not had a Bradford Literature Festival event where we've had so many people back in the room. So thank you for coming on this day as well. So yeah, I'm Akil Ahmed. I'm going to be chairing it today. I formerly head of religion and ethics at the BBC and Channel 4, and have been working in media and broadcasting for quite some time, and have a few other little things as well as being a director of the festival. And with us today, we have the historian Abdul Rahman Azam. Then we have how can I describe you? Writer, feminist icon, and Egyptian royalty.
Hey, no, I'm anti-monarchy. Don't say that.
No, right. Egyptian anti-monarchist Mona El-Tahawi. And on my immediate right, because obviously he loves to be described as the far right, is my good friend, Professor Syed Qutb from Michigan University. Is that right?
Wayne State University of Michigan.
Wayne State University of Michigan.
You got the country right.
I got the country. Exactly. There you go. You think I'd know it by now.
We're just here to give you a hard time, Akil.
That's exactly what's going to happen. So what we're going to do today, we're going to be talking about, obviously, it's the 100 years since the mandate in Egypt, but also it's not just the 100-year anniversary. 1952 is also an anniversary, which is the Egyptian Revolution. So it's not just going to be a conversation about what happened 100 years ago, it's going to be a conversation of what has happened in those 100 years. That's the point. And I think 1952, 1956, and then things that come after that, possibly 1967, even 1970, and onwards, there are so many key landmark moments to have a conversation about. So to start off with, I will turn to the historian amongst us and just ask you, really, why should we be interested in what happened 100 years ago?
The thing about 1922, the fascinating thing about it, if you went to Egypt, you're not going to find anybody who's either going to commemorate, remember, let alone celebrate 1922. 22 doesn't mean anything to the Egyptians. And I think that's the first reason. And the main reason for that, because 1922 was a unilateral declaration of independence imposed by the British on the Egyptians, who certainly did not want it. So I agree with you, 1922. Why it's important, there are certain reasons. The Constitution, of course, there are many reasons we can discuss at a later stage. But the most significant dates I would look at are, if you're going to look at the 1922 period, is of course going backwards a few years in 1919. In 1919 is a seismic event in Egypt. In 1919, the Egyptians just to give you background, the British came to Egypt in 1882.
Can we hear, by the way?
Sorry, can you hear?
Can people hear?
Yeah,
Okay,
great. Oh, sorry, maybe the mic.
There you go.
Is that better? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
The thing about the British and Egypt, I've always looked at it as there's almost something Shakespearean, like a tragedy that takes place between the British and the Egyptians. It starts off in 1882 when the British come in, and they come in with this kind of very cool public school, oh, we're not here to colonize Egypt. Of course not. Egypt was never a colony of Britain. The Egyptians never play cricket. That's one thing I've always noticed. You won't find the Egyptians playing cricket. And the first thing they say is, we're not going to rule Egypt. We have no interest in Egypt. We're just here to protect the canal, the foreign interests. Crime, we have to bring crime down, and we have to take care of these poor oppressed Egyptian women. Of course, they do absolutely nothing, and that's something we can come back to. So in 1882, and in the first 5 or 6 years of British rule, between 1882 onwards, there's like 120 declarations in Parliament from the Brits, from Lord Cromer onwards, saying, we're not here to rule Egypt, we're not going to colonize Egypt, we're only here for a little while, we're going to leave. The truth is, of course, they had no intention of leaving. Many reasons for that, of course. The Suez Canal, very lucrative. The wealth of Alexandria, the cotton. If you look at Lawrence Durrell's books, Alexandria Quartet, he writes about the cotton kings. And so, as the years pass by, the tragedy becomes worse and worse, and there are some significant dates, 1906, the Dinshwai affair, which is hugely important, 1919, until you get to 56. And in 56, there's madness that takes place. We've got Anthony Eden, the protege of Churchill, the young, the darling of the establishment, an Arabist, by the way, thumping the cabinet table saying, I want to kill Nasser, I want to destroy Egypt. So you've got this elegant entry in 1882, descending into almost like a madness of blood. And, they decide literally to go back into Egypt with their arms, completely ignoring the fact that the empire had finished. that since 1922, since 1919, since 1906, you could even say, the Egyptians were claiming back their independence. And the Americans basically told them, look, it's over, just go home. There's no longer, and that's why from then on, Suez has become such a seismic event for British in Egypt.
So would you say then, Mona, that obviously 1922 is a moment when the British make this thing about saying that when the British government talks about leaving Egypt, but doesn't really leave Egypt, it's not as important to say what happens in 1952, or does 52 only happen because of the situation we find ourselves with, like this anniversary 100 years on of this independent declaration of independence for Egypt?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me begin with the way that I usually begin, because this is my thing now that we're all in the same room together, and you've already heard me say this, Syed, but this is my traveling roadshow. Hello, everyone. My name is Mona Al-Tahawi. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I begin everything everywhere I speak with my declaration of faith, fuck the patriarchy. And that's going to basically be the parameters within which I contribute today, because I'm here as the resident feminist and only woman on the stage. So my entry point into all of this is to actually pick up on a point that you mentioned, Abdurrahman, and I'm really glad you did mention it. It matters little to me, what happened in 22 or 52 or any of that. What does matter to me is what the British claim to be doing and what they were actually doing. And I'm looking specifically at Lord Cromer, who was the High Commissioner. And this is a man who was essentially talking from both sides of his mouth, because while in Egypt, he was making a big fuss about Egyptian women, saving brown women from brown men, and all of this business, while at the same time, he belonged to a group in the UK that was against the enfranchisement of women. So he was against women's right to vote and to run for office at the same time as women were the suffragists were chaining themselves to your parliament fences and going on hunger strike and being forced to eat simply for the right to vote, and throwing themselves in front of horses and dying for the right to vote. And Lord Cromer was against that right to vote, so he was a patriarchal fuck in the UK. But in Egypt, he presented himself, as so many of the colonizers did, as this liberator of brown women from brown men, which is basically at the heart of so many colonial projects across the world. In my book, Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, I touch upon that in the chapter on Egypt, when I talk about the changes that have happened with by and for and imposed on Egyptian women in the 20th century, where I look at Egyptian women before Nasser came to power and what has happened to Egyptian women since key dates like 1967 and to the current day in Egypt, because my book begins where the revolutions, the most recent revolutions, quote unquote, ended, when people went home, because I asked what happens when the revolution goes home. So I'm more interested in this idea that he was a man representing Britain in Egypt and posing himself as this liberator of women, who at the same time was clearly not a liberator of women here. And
we've seen that in America, obviously, with
I was going to say,
Afghanistan.
and in Afghanistan, George Bush, and that's exactly what I say in my book, George Bush actually gave his the presidents in the US have these weekly radio addresses, and he gave his wife, Laura Bush, the weekly address before the invasion of Afghanistan, because of course it was presented as a way to liberate Afghan women from Afghan men and liberate them from burqas. And the Americans tried the same with Iraq, even though the position and the status of Iraqi women was very different than that of Afghan women. And this is all from a country which, as we know yesterday, overturned Roe v. Wade and is far from a feminist liberator of anyone, when it's its own women, as I like to remind them. I'm in the United States to save white women from white men. So this is the complication that I'm here to talk about. I'm less interested in the politics that men bring to the table, where they sit there and argue, was this the year of independence? Was this the year of colonization? Was this the year of the revolution? And I'm here to complicate that and say, this is the year of patriarchal fuckery, whether it was you coming over from the UK, or you coming over from the US, or you, my local patriarchal misogynist that I'm dealing with. So that's my role today. That's what I will be doing.
Can I just add a quick point to what Mona is saying about Lord Cromer? The British at no point wanted the Egyptians to be educated. In the 40 years between 1882 and 1922, less than 1% of Egyptian women could read or write. This was in 1882. In 1922, it was the same figure. there was no improvement at all in the literacy. The British stopped the teaching of Arabic, but above all, they did not want the Egyptians to be educated for the simple reason because Lord Cromer had come from India and had seen what happens when you educate locals. They get uppity and they start asking for independence. So I agree totally with what Mona is saying. At no point, despite his rhetoric, was there any genuine or sincere attempt to educate the Egyptian women.
Do you think this is, these are important things to have a conversation about, or is it, as Mona says, this stuff happened in the past? It's not as relevant to the situation we're in today, where we need to talk about what the situation is on the ground today, particularly in Egypt, and the freedoms that people don't have.
Yeah, and what's the saying that the past is prologue? I think that's pretty apt when we take a look at what's happening here. There's two reasons why history is important. Three, if you count the fact that it keeps me employed, first of all, it helps us contextualize and understand what's happening now. It reduces the possibility of then seeing the people to simply dismiss themselves in, ironically, the same Orientalist way and saying, well, that's just how they are. This is their pathology. They've always been this way. They always will be this way. And then I think it's also important to recognize that it's less important whether we care about history, but the people that we are studying care an awful lot about their history. And this then helps forge and frame national identities, national perceptions, individual identity and individual perception. So I think it's hugely important. And what we do as historians, I think, is very important in the sense that we show not that it's just within an isolated context. And contrary to, I think, what some people might want us to do, which is assign blame and virtue signal who was wrong and who was right and who was evil and who was not, I find it to be much more interesting to see and connect the dots. I mean, here, Abdul Rahman talks about Cromer being in India. People were in motion. They weren't static. They were going from place to place. And looking at, for example, the fact that Egypt was in many ways, we're talking about getting in the TARDIS and moving back in time. We can talk about 1798, when Napoleon invades Egypt, and the fact that it was the British that then came in as a white knight to help the Ottoman Empire get back their province from France. They, of course, didn't care much about Egypt at the time. They might have had a strategic idea later on, but this was really to go ahead and stick it to their big rivals across the English Channel. I always find it interesting that when Napoleon shows up in Egypt and he says, "Nous sommes vrais musulmans," he says, "We're all Muslim," and they're like, "Who's we?" The very idea that how did he become familiar with Islam, in part that was because of his interaction with Tipu Sultan in India, because of course you had the French and the British conflict there that culminates with the Battle of Plassey. The fact that there has been a global conflict involving colonial powers and empires, and that the actual game board of where that was happening, places like Egypt, I think is incredibly important. And you mentioned, Abdul Rahman, you mentioned the Dunshuey incident. So very briefly, up in the Nile Delta, small, probably unremarkable village of Dunshuey, swampy land, 3 British soldiers go there on furlough to go pigeon hunting. And they shot some pigeons which weren't apparently for sale. They belonged to the local villagers. And in fact, this caused the ire of some people, including the muezzin's wife. And so when she started to harangue the officers for killing the pigeons, a scuffle broke out, and she was also physically hit. The British soldiers were injured. 2 were injured mildly. 1 died not from the conflict, but because of heat stroke. Because as we well know, being out in about 35 to 40 degree weather in a humid area is good for every person who has grown up in England, as the ability to sustain it without Lucozade back then. And the thing to really take away from Dunshuey was, first of all, the brutal collective punishment of 52 people who were then sentenced, most for either life imprisonment or flogging, 4 to death. The entire village was forced to then watch the public execution. The problem, though, is that there were thousands of Dunshues in the British Empire where that kind of contempt for the local population was being shown, that kind of brutality was being shown. It was replicated on a daily basis. Dunshue just simply made the newspapers in London, to which even George Bernard Shaw was like, what are we doing? And what does it say about our own collective identity, leading to Cromer's resignation, and then, of course, Gorst, and then Kitchener coming in. So I think that when we're looking at it, and hopefully people have the patience to hear a historian go ahead and provide the long version, as opposed to the 280 characters on Twitter.
But does that have any impact on today?
Absolutely,
Yes,
because
No,
it
of
is.
course, I'm just asking the question. I mean, what's the real direct connection that you would like to?
Well, look
rather than
at
stop-
the exercise that we have done just in the last few minutes. We started off talking about the 100th anniversary of, and I don't think it was a mandate, I think it was a protectorate. It would be kind to think that the British wanted to treat Egypt as a mandate, because that would mean some certain deadline of leaving. They had no designs on leaving. But the very fact that we talked about 100 years ago, and it has resonance, 30 years later with, God, it was only 30 years later,
yeah.
with what happened in 1952 with the rise of the Free Officers Corps revolution. And then also Abdurrahman mentioning 1882, and my mentioning 1798. I mean, you'd think that we were playing historical bingo with all of these numbers.
Are they, Mona? Are these men playing historical bingo? And is it irrelevant?
Well, look, of course it's relevant because we have to remind these countries that thought they could go to other places and effectively just steal their resources and pretend to be civilizing them in any shape or form, that, you know, there was nothing civilizing. It was the ultimate in uncivility and being uncivilized in doing that. So of course it's important to remember that, because, you know, that there are large groups of people in the UK still who hark back to this empire of yours and think it was a good thing. It was a horrendous thing. It was a crime. So in that sense, we have to remember what happened historically. Of course, history is important. But my point about history is that when it's always men talking about history, there's a viewpoint that men, and I'm not talking about the men on this stage, this is not to attack Abdurrahman or Saeed. This is
Because none of us want to see that. Oh, maybe we do actually.
No, I want to recognize that we're all performing very different roles here. Like the entry point to a historian in this, and the entry point to a feminist, and the entry point to a professor of the subjects that you teach, Saeed, I think all of them together, I hope, give you a viewpoint that complicates and enriches what you think about when you think about Egypt and Britain. So this isn't to come here and say you can't talk about history because it's irrelevant. Of course it's relevant. But what angles are you using to look at history? And whose history are you looking at? Because history isn't just written by the victor, as that old adage goes. It's also invariably written by men. And when men write history, it's a very different entry point than when you come and ask us, the rest of us, whose lives and lived experiences are not taken into account. And so what I'm trying to do here is say, colonization, empires are terrible. But I also want to connect when we finally kicked the Brits out in Egypt in 1952, what I say and what so many other Egyptians say is that we replaced one occupier with another. Because what we ended up doing is these free officers that rose up, Nasser and the others, it was a combination of a coup and a revolution. So we kicked out the Brits, we forced the king to abdicate, and then what happened? We replaced the external occupier, the Brits, with the internal occupier, the military, which continues to occupy Egypt to this day. We have been under military rule since 1952. Some people would make the argument that we've been under military rule in Egypt since way before. Some take it all the way to the pharaohs, some take it to the Mamluks. You know, it depends on where you want to begin history. Where does history begin? But let's just say for now, for the sake of this particular discussion, let's say 1952, because 1952 is often paraded as the great day of independence for Egypt. We celebrate it as such. We got rid of the Brits, we got rid of the king, we're now free. Thank you, Nasser. Nasser did bring some good things, but Nasser also destroyed a lot of things. And at the same time, we had incredible levels of poverty and lack of education, as you were saying, Abdurrahman, under the king, even though there was a vibrant political system under the king, but for who? Who did it benefit, you know? So my point here is we've got to complicate the history that we talk about. It can't just be through these dates and this happened. What also happened underneath all of this and its ramifications and consequences to this day?
Well, if we go to 1952, because that is the key jumping point that actually. I come to this from the point of view of actually understanding what happens in 52 and 56 onwards defines the world that we live in today, right? That's one of the key things that I think of. So if we say, are you able, Abdul Rahman, just to talk some people through what happens in 52 and 56? Because in 1952 and 1956 you have the revolution, etc. But what you have then is a change in the dynamics of the Middle East, but also a change in, as Mona quite rightly says, the change in Egypt from old Egypt to modern Egypt.
Yes. I mean, you don't see the new Egypt emerging till the 60s probably, because it took a while for the old Egypt to understand 52. We've touched upon it, of course. You cannot understand 52 unless we go back to 1922. We've discussed that, and we can discuss it more. You can't understand 52. I'd like to place it within a regional context and the 1948 war that took place, the battle in Palestine, because that really shook the Arab world in a way which was very profound. The revolutions that took place in the Arab world after the Second World War, the whole independence movement that took place. Don't forget that, Libya, the independence of Libya in 49, the movement for independence in Algeria, in Syria, the coups in Syria that took place. So one has to look at it as a regional context. There was definitely a strong nationalist movement. We have to look at 52 and look at the constitution that was set up in 1922, 23, and the way the Brits left Egypt in 22, because that constitution effectively handicapped any Egyptian dialogue and movements towards a representative government. The king at that time was literally playing the political parties. The Brits were playing the political parties to make sure there's actually, the WEF did not have the strength, the WEF party or the main nationalist party did not have the strength. There was a lot of interfighting between the parties. So 52 was a direct result of the political failure of the 1920s and 30s. And they call it Egypt's liberal experiment. But as Mona was saying, it's a liberal experiment played by a handful of politicians who spoke fluent French. If I can just go back to a point, because it's fascinating. In 1919, 1922, a lot has been said about the Egyptian women taking to the streets. And 1919 was an amazing, amazing revolution. And going back to, Said, very quickly before I talk about the women's side, 1919, everybody in Egypt knew what was happening. They knew what happened in Ireland in 1916. They knew what was happening in India. These people knew. Michael Collins was a name that was known in Egypt. This is a global struggle. The Irish were looking at Egypt. Iraq was looking at Egypt.
Many British people don't realise just how Michael Collins was big in what became Pakistan.
Absolutely. Michael Collins in Egypt.
He's like a rock star over there. He was a rock star over there.
And in Egypt, Michael Collins is seen as a hero.
And in Palestine.
So, it's a global thing. But going back to 1919, the narrative we're always told is that in 1919, the Egyptian women took to the streets. And we get people like Huda Sha'rawi, Safiya Zaghloul, these people. This is not the case. What happened was that these women were the elite Egyptian, although many working class, many fallahin came out. My mother now, bless her, is in her 80s. And when I speak to her, she remembers her mother and her grandmother being active, saying, enough is enough, we want the Brits out. So there's a living memory of Egyptians. But what happens in 1922, once Egypt gets its independence? The women are told, go back home. You have no role to play at all in this revolution. Thank you very much. Your job now is to go back to the house. And I'd like to give one very, very fascinating example of what took place. Around 1919, if I'm correct, 1919, I don't know if you've heard about these two sisters in Alexandria called Raya Oskina. Very interesting two sisters who killed women. They were serial killers. And they ended up killing, I think, 17 or 27 women and stealing their jewelry and so forth. This caused a huge scandal in Egypt, huge scandal. And they were taken to court, and they actually condemned, the first woman ever to be condemned to death. Now, what's so interesting about this story is this was happening exactly the same time as the 1919 revolution and so forth, what was taking place. But they did not represent, these were not the Huda Sha'rawis, these were not the Safiya Zaghlouls of Egypt. These were peasant women who barely spoke, and in the courtroom, of course, the Egyptian newspapers covered them in modern standard Arabic, not in the Arabic they were speaking. These were women who were spit on the ground, who were There were prostitutes and they ran brothels. The British actually brought in the brothels and made them legal in Egypt at that time, I should add. But what's interesting is this new Egyptian state that came out in 1922 actually decided these two women had to die because they did not represent the modern Egypt that was coming out. They wanted a pure Egypt. Egypt is a feminine word, in the maternal Egypt. So these two women, who actually did not kill anybody, their husbands were the ones who did the murders, were condemned to death. And the Safiya Zaghlouls and the Huda Sha'rawis and these Egyptian elite women were seen as the new modern Egypt. So when they say that there was a woman and a feminist revolution in Egypt in the 20s, there wasn't. This was the Weft party trying to control the narrative again. But sorry, to answer your question, 52 took place because of the failures of the 20s and the 30s. What it meant for Egypt was a complete upheaval in the society, complete upheaval. I come from a family which is, I guess you'd call aristocratic. We lost all our land under Nasser. We got it back under Sadat. And if you speak to my point of view, is that 52 led to 67.
Yeah.
And that was it. All the rhetoric of Nasser going to Yemen, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. They just walked into a trap, and the result was 67. So to me, it was a colossal failure. Having said that, of course, he did do some socioeconomic benefits for the Egyptians, which would probably have taken place anyway.
Well, I was going to say that, Mona. Do you recognise any of that stuff about the women going home after the revolution? Because obviously you were part of the recent revolution that had tried and failed in Egypt. Mm-hmm. Is it that simple, just to say that actually that women that happened then and it's happened now?
I don't like to say the revolution has failed. I say that the revolution takes many cycles in order to achieve what it's achieved. Because I think to say the revolution has failed, that all the people who died in the name of the revolution and who continue to be in Sisi's jails, have suffered for now, basically. I'm a tenacious optimist, and I believe we will be free eventually. So I think revolutions around the world historically have always used women, and for various reasons, whether because they want to create a new woman, as you were saying, or whether they want to say, look, this is a revolution for everyone. But whether it was Algeria, whether it was Egypt, whether, across the world, the US Revolution, the French Revolution, revolutions historically and globally have always used women's participation and then told them to go home, because those revolutions are always basically a revolution against the state, and that ends up being men wanting the kind of power that the state has that will benefit them then. And that's where women become an inconvenience, because it's about a group of men who want to increase the amount of power that they have. And that's why I always say the revolution has to be against the state, the street, and the home, what I call the trifecta of misogyny, because we have a dictator on the street corner and a dictator in the home. And that's where the men who just want a revolution against the state don't see. They just want, they see the state oppressing everyone, and they don't see that they're complicit in the way that the state, the street, and the home together oppress women. So that has happened across the world. And I want to also bring in another figure who, yes, was also a member of the elite, but I think that she also achieved something, and that is Doraya Shafiq and her feminist group at the time, who after 1952, Nasser promised women the vote, and they didn't get it. And so as a way to protest that, a feminist called Doraya Shafiq, who had a feminist group called, and a magazine called Bint al-Nil, Daughter of the Nile, stormed the Egyptian parliament with 1,500 women, much to the chagrin of the Nasser, the Muslim Brotherhood, the judiciary, so many people. And they staged a sit-in in the parliament and said, we're not going to leave until we get a promise that we're going to get the right to vote and run for office in Egypt. And they met with the prime minister, the vice prime minister, all of that, and they were promised, and still it didn't come. And eventually it came. Women got the right to vote because they went on hunger strike. But before that, women mobilized to help in the fight back against the tripartite aggression, as it's called, in 1956. So eventually women got the right to vote, but after all of these things. But the thing the reason I want to bring Doraya Shafiq in is because of, and it connects it to revolutions and women, because after women got the right to vote, thanks to the effort of many, many people, including Doraya Shafiq and her group, Doraya Shafiq began to warn Egyptians, and again, many people were, but she was specifically targeted, that Nasser was becoming a dictator, which he was. He was becoming a tyrant. And to punish her, he shut down her feminist group, he shut down her magazine, he erased her from the public record and put her in house arrest. And she was under house arrest until he died. I think it was 15 years later. And then Sadat took over, and he kept her under house arrest. She was under house arrest, this one woman, for a total of 18 years, which is the equivalent of the house arrest that Aung San Suu Kyi, back when we used to like her. Aung San Suu Kyi was under house arrest for 18 years. So was Doré Shafiq. And her house arrest only ended when she jumped from the balcony and died by suicide. And I bring her up because it's in recognition of the ways that women, their contributions to the revolutions, their contributions to complicating the political narrative, to saying this man is a tyrant. And at the time, many people on the left didn't like her because she wasn't leftist enough for them, because she was too elite for them, because she traveled the world and she wasn't like, you know, the poor peasant Egyptian women, but she was also saying something they didn't want to hear because they supported Nasser. So this is, again, in order to complicate the narratives that we have of people. Nasser was a post-colonial hero, yes, but Nasser was also a tyrant. And he erased this woman. This is what happens with revolutions, that we bring women out and say, look, you know, this happened in Sudan recently. Look, women involved in the revolution. And then the Sudanese military raped and sexually assaulted these very same women that were being celebrated as revolutionaries. And this is why I say this is what I'm here to do. You know, to tell you, yes, Nasser achieved some good things. Yes, Nasser also achieved terrible things. Among them was the erasure of this woman, who is a symbol of the way that women across the world, not just in Egypt, come out, form a political role, complicate the political narrative, and then are erased. And so when the revolution happened in Egypt in 2011, one of the most significant things that feminists at the time and continue to do today is to resurrect the names of feminists who have been erased from our history, and to recognize what they achieved and to recognize what they've done. Now, as far as elections in Egypt are concerned, elections in Egypt are shit. They achieved nothing. So while I'm glad that she fought for the right to vote, I'm an anarchist and I barely believe in elections to begin with. But the fight that she fought is an important fight. And it was to warn people that Nasser is a tyrant and that tyranny continues in the shape now of Sisi and his predecessors. So let's always remember feminism as a political force that complicates the very, very safe and comfortable narratives that we have, and never allow it to be erased in the way that we've seen it.
You're definitely right about Egyptian elections. Like I think in one election I was invited onto a TV show to be the pundit. And I said to myself, there won't be a lot to say, really.
Exactly.
Yeah, and as they said, why? I goes, because Mubarak will get 95 to 97% of the vote. Mm-hmm. And they said, how do you know that? I goes, because he always does. Because if you control the country like you do, you do. But anyway, but Syed, we've come to Abdel Nasser, right? Now, this is a very complicated character. It's difficult for me. I grew up in a household where Nasser was God, right? And I've had to go on a journey.
I thought it was Clapton was God.
No, not Eric Clapton in my house. But
he was a punk.
Exactly, Paul Weller and
That's
Joe
more
Strummer.
like
Paul Weller and Joe Strummer were our gods. But the god of but my dad is that generation of people who were influenced by Arab nationalism in the 40s and 50s and 60s and all this kind of thing. So basically, Nasser is this complicated character, right? Mm-hmm. And there is an argument that says a lot of the problems that we have today, you could argue all of them. You know, we touched on 67, the collapse of the Arab armies in 1967 and the occupation of Gaza, West Bank, Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem by the Israelis. You could talk about what happens then with regards to society in Egypt and many other countries as well, post-Nasser. And even Syed Qutb, is a product of that kind of Nasser kind of, Syed Qutb, the man who creates the Muslim Brotherhood, you could argue, creates the kind of ideology that gives us Al-Qaeda and all those kind of things. When I say you could argue, I argued it in my Emmy-nominated documentary on it. But the thing is that kind of argument is there, that Nasser is the key to all of this. Yet it's really hard for certain people to let go of this image of Nasser as being this kind of like icon. A man who loses a war, destroys his nation, loses the third most holiest site in Islam to somebody else, and yet isn't allowed to resign, right? And ends up staying on, and is lauded even in his death a few years later. So, do we need to start talking more about Abdel Nasser? Do people not talk about him enough?
I just want to say that Hassan al-Banna created the Muslim Brotherhood, not Syed Qutb.
No, I know he didn't create it, but he's sorry, I meant,
Right.
Yeah.
Just sort of.
He's one of the intellectual,
thinkers, yeah.
one of the intellectual leaders, yeah.
Yes.
The version 2.0 of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll give you that one, yeah. Well, actually, I mean, so this is an interesting framing of this, my friend. Was it Nasser's third holy site of Islam to lose, or was that really the Jordanians? Right? I mean, that's I think a very important question to go ahead and ask.
If you read the transcripts, he's telling the Jordanians that they're flying over Tel Aviv. So they say, we're joining in as well.
Sure,
and
but
they
I mean,
join in, and then
as far
there's
as
Jerusalem in a minute.
who at that time had control over the site. So you know, I mean, in my library at home, in my personal library, I probably have about 5, maybe 6 biographies of Nasser. Saeed Abu Rish's book, The Last Arab. Anthony Nutting, who was working with Anthony Eden, and what you realize is that you have to read all of these. I mean, it is a little bit cumbersome to have to read 5 or 6 biographies of somebody, but you then get a fuller picture of who's Nasser. I mean, I'm fascinated by what you said, that Nasser was a god in your home. He was the exact opposite within mine. And I'll tell you the story, if I may, about why. My father was graduated as a doctor and was at that time working in Saudi Arabia during the time of the Yemen War. And so there were a lot of, because of the cross-border issues, many Yemenis who were injured would come to Saudi Arabia for medical treatment. And at the same time, there were a lot of Egyptian doctors who were colleagues of my father. And they were paying closer attention to what was happening with Nasser than we are about the cricket match today. Priorities. But the fact that really what rubbed my father the wrong way is that the Egyptian doctors would have contempt for the Yemenis who were coming in because they were on the wrong side of the war. And the other thing that really bothered him is because the Egyptian doctors would say, Bismillah wa Bismillah Nasser, in the name of God and in the name of Nasser. Yes. And so this, I mean, is pretty blasphemous, unless you're a Nasser fan. And so that shaped his worldview of who Nasser was. And having conversations with my father about the complexity of the man helped shift his attitude. I mean, I'm not an evangelist for Nasser by any stretch of the imagination, but I enjoy and appreciate the complexities. So the question then, I think that is part of the question you're asking, Akil, is that to whom does Nasser belong? I mean, who gets to then decide which is the authentic Nasser? This is like one of those game shows, who will the real Nasser stand up, or will the real Slim Shady please stand up? And I think that this is the beauty of history, that we can actually have a conversation about this, that we can actually have a debate about this, and with a certain level of respect that you have your subjective view of a person like Nasser, and then there is an objective reality which is actually a sum total of all of those subjectivities. That's what interests me the most. Instead of being compelled to say, was he a great guy? Was he a hero? Was he a villain? Was he this? I mean, he was all of these things.
I want to add on to that, Saeed. I'm so glad you said that, because one of the most fascinating things for me in Egypt since the 2011 revolution was, so I started to go, I lived in New York at the time when the revolution began, but I moved back to Egypt for 4 years after the revolution. And it was watching my Egyptian friends in real time begin to reassess their position on Nasser. And I'm talking about younger Egyptian friends who weren't even possibly alive at the time when Nasser was. So my parents were born in 1943, so they experienced Nasser. I was born in 1967, the year of the Naksa, as we call it, because of the defeat in the war with Israel. So my parents experienced, like five wars with Israel. I experienced 3, something like that. But I'm talking about younger Egyptian friends who didn't experience any wars with Israel, so they have none of this. Nasser is the one who lost all of these things. And they weren't even there to experience Nasser as a post-colonial, liberator from the colonizers. But what they did have was this legacy of Nasser, and that they held on to so fiercely. And then I was just watching it just fray, finally, because they were beginning to connect Nasser and the military, and that beginning of military rule, as I was saying, with what is happening in Egypt now, and the way that the military has stolen our elections. And it was really difficult for them to do that. And these were friends who would go to the Nasser Mosque every year, to pray and take part in, commemorative prayers on the anniversary of his death, and go and listen to the sermon, eulogizing him and all of that. And just over those 4 years when I lived in Egypt, to watch so many young Egyptians, for me, it was a great thing to watch because, destroy your idols, be iconoclast, because that's the only way the revolution is going to succeed. And it was incredible and really liberating and wonderful to see them finally let go of Nasser and begin to see him in that complicated way. Now, these were my friends who were not members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Regardless to say, if you come from a Muslim Brotherhood family in Egypt, Nasser was never a hero.
No.
Because Nasser imprisoned so many and tortured so many. This is where Syed Qutb comes in. And now he's like the person who likes to present himself as his successor, Sisi. By no stretch of the imagination, and I'm not a massive Nasser fan, but Sisi is by no stretch of the imagination.
I knew Abdel
any
Nasser
kind of
and you're
successor.
no Abdel Nasser. Yeah.
Oh my God, he's not even a mini one, but he also has been horrendous in crushing the Muslim Brotherhood and the massacre in Rabaa and Nahda Square.
Well, they don't seem to learn from it, do they?
What's that?
They don't seem to learn in Egypt
No, but
from their mistakes.
We're stuck in
in
Egypt
a
between
cycle.
the Muslim Brotherhood and the
Yeah.
military, and how often the military can continue to torture and massacre the Muslim Brotherhood. And those of us who belong to neither side are always saying that the revolution comes in breaking this paradigm of this dichotomy of you're either with the military or either with the Muslim Brotherhood. And we're saying we're Egyptians who want to be liberated from both military rule and a political Islamic rule,
Yeah.
So this is where I find the most interesting dynamic
If I could
happening.
just add, sorry,
Yeah.
but going back to Nasser, I actually remember when Nasser died. I was a very young boy. We were living in Lebanon. And the first thing to say about this is that I think Nasser was loved more by the Arabs than by the Egyptians.
Yeah.
The whole Palestinian left wing, And I was a very young boy in Beirut. And I remember his death. I don't remember much about it, but the streets, we were not allowed to go down on the streets that day because there were huge demonstrations. The Lebanese were firing guns into the sky against God. How could God take Nasser away from us? This is a man who had just led us to a big disaster, 67. Interestingly enough, I remember I can't remember, 2-3 years later, when Kulthum died. Same demonstrations. And this time we're all really, Kulthum, I think, had a bit more
That's
impact.
just in case that's an Egyptian female singer.
She's like a Maria Callas, Edith Piaf, I don't know what she is. She's incredible. Kulthum. My grandfather knew Abdel Nasser very well. My grandfather was, he was the first Secretary General of the Arab League. He was one of the Arab nationalists of the 1940s and 50s. He was, and he always told me the story about Yemen. He actually met with Abdel Nasser on many, and occasionally after 52, my grandfather realized he couldn't deal with him, so he had to leave Egypt. But he actually went to him many times, and he used to come to our house in Aguza. And he said to him, if you carry on with the Yemen, you're going to lead into a huge disaster. You cannot fight Yemen, because nobody fights Yemen. The British failed, everybody fails. Fighting Yemen is like fighting Afghanistan, the Afghans, you cannot win. Also, it's going to drain your forces. You're fighting King Faisal in Saudi Arabia. There's a whole thing's going to, dynamic is wrong, and you're going to suffer from 67. So, not just from an ideological point of view, I agree with what Mona is saying, the military rule, but also from a purely military strategic point of view, he was a disaster for Egypt.
So can I just quickly move it on a little bit for the audience as well, which is to say, so why does Abdel Nasser's revolution, if it is a revolution, but obviously there's the revolution in 52, he then takes over within a few years. Why does it fail then? Why is Egyptian society not changed? Is it simply because the military is there? Or is there something more than that? Because I just want to know why it's failed. Because you have revolutions in other countries. I mean, you could look at Turkey and Ataturk, etc. Was it just not extreme enough? The Ataturk revolution was very extreme, and that's why we have the Turkey we have today. But why does it not work? Why has Egyptian society not been changed for the better? Is it simply, can we just simply pin it on the fact that the military have been there since day one?
Well, I think society has changed.
That's
I think it's the political structure that hasn't changed, and there is a difference, and this is why I say our elections are shit.
But it's still a country that relies on a lot of significant aid.
Well, it shouldn't.
Yeah.
It shouldn't.
No,
It really
but-
shouldn't, because
so
the
it doesn't work then, does
steals.
it? Because it has to rely on aid.
Well, no, look, we're talking about a political structure that is propped up to a large extent by so much aid and military sales and the weapons that they're given by various Western countries. The United States, here, other European countries. I mean, like we've got Italy, for example, an Italian citizen was tortured to death in Egypt, Giulio Regeni, a few years ago. The Italians swore up and down they'd never have any kind of relations with Egypt, and they're selling us weapons again, and gas, and I don't know what, and all this natural gas, and all that stuff. So look, you have to make a distinction between the political regime and that structure that is propped up by the military and all these Western countries, and Egyptian society. And Egyptian society has changed. If you look at the revolution, and this is why I say our entry point into this has to be more about than just dates and who said what and who signed a treaty with what. If you look at my own family, I come from a massive extended family. My mum is one of 11 and my dad is one of 8. And we come from a solidly middle-class background. We're not working class and we're not aristocrats. Thanks to Nasser's education and free education in universities and all that stuff, all my aunts and uncles have university degrees, right? Mm-hmm. So, but I look at my extended family now, and since the revolution in 2011, just the really simple, but very complicated social markers of divorce, the number of women in my country who've been divorced since the Egyptian revolution is incredible. And I asked my parents, and I meet with my parents when I live close to them. When I moved back to Egypt, I would go and spend 2 days every week with my parents, and they'd sit there and catch me up with the extended family story, and they'd say, Tante so-and-so is getting divorced, and I don't know what cousin so-and-so is getting divorced. And, I would play naive. My parents are not naive. My parents were very pro-revolution. But, I'm the feminist instigator here, and my mum's like, you're always talking about sex. You're always talking about sex. And then I say to her, so why do you think Tante Salwa is getting divorced? And my mum would say to me, because of the revolution, So we are talking about incredible social changes that are happening in Egypt that are not seen, because the only way Egypt is covered is from this political lens that just looks up here. And the argument that I'm making is look in here. We're talking about queer issues now in Egypt, LGBTQ issues, unprecedented. So feminism, queer issues, social changes in Egypt. All at the same time as up here in the political structure, nothing has changed. And a terrible war is being fought in Sinai that we're being denied knowledge of, and massacres are happening, and the Americans give us weapons, and the Russians give us weapons. So you have to refocus your entry point into Egypt. So when you say to me the revolution has failed, politically, yes. Socially, it's incredible the amount of changes that have happened in
And
Egypt.
very positive changes at that. There's a young generation of Egyptians. They're absolutely brilliant. They're coming up. They're tech savvy, they're entrepreneurial, they help each other, they're globalist.
How are they going to sit within the current framework that we've got, though?
As long as there's no private sector growth, as long as, unfortunately, the population grows, these are socioeconomic issues which are beyond any one government, I think. But the military has to allow the private sector more participation in the economy. There has to be more entrepreneurial investment. I'm not an economist, I wouldn't know. But I go to Egypt quite frequently. I'm super impressed by the young generation of Egyptians that are emerging now. Yeah. Bilingual, tech-savvy, fully conversant with what's happening in global issues, tremendous self-confident, pious as well. They've preserved their traditions, but still liberal in their attitudes. And this binary argument between the military and the brotherhood is nonsensical in extent. The vast majority of Egyptians don't give a damn about this or that. They just want to live their lives. And they are succeeding despite the huge, huge socioeconomic problems that Egypt faces. And let's face it, every other Arab country faces as well. It's not just Egypt.
I suppose it's a big country. It
120.
could have had the opposite. If you think about over the last 70 years, 50, even longer, particularly the last 60 to 70 years, you would imagine it would have kicked on. It would have kicked on much more.
But let me tell you this: there are 25 million Egyptians who were born after the revolution. There are 2 million Egyptians, just over 2 million Egyptians being born every single year. There are 25 million Egyptians who were born after the revolution. How do you educate these people? How do you provide health? This is a problem which is enormous. I mean, I wouldn't know. I have no idea how you do it. And I think it goes well beyond any political machinations.
I love your numbers. I'm so glad you gave those numbers, Abdul Rahman, because at the same time, since the revolution, Sisi and his regime have built more prisons than schools and hospitals. So this is what we're talking about here. This is kind of the clash that is happening, where he doesn't recognize the changing demographics and the changing attitudes and the growing confidence of young Egyptians. And what he's more interested and invested in is imprisoning people who dare to say, we are different and we want more.
How do you get rid of Sisi then? No, I mean, I know you might say it's a silly question, But other countries have. I mean, if you look at Turkey, and I mean, it's a difficult one in Pakistan because the military is still there, but they're not as there as they were probably in my childhood. I'd lived through that Zia revolution.
Well,
But if you look at Turkey, the notion that the military would ever come back, yet most of my teenage years were spent demonstrating against the Turkish military, So in that sense, how is it? It is possible, but what do you have to do? Does there have to be a revolution that physically succeeds, if that's the better way of describing it, or is it some other thing, or is it economics, demographics?
I'll tell you, look, I was a journalist in Jerusalem for Reuters news agency for several years, and I've lived in the US since 2000, and obviously I'm Egyptian. The three countries in the world who are most obsessed and basically worship their militaries are those three countries. Israel, the United States, and Egypt. I've never seen countries that are more obsessed with their military.
I'll take to Pakistan sometime.
Oh, okay.
You'll see some worship over there as well.
But I mean, but I've, having experienced all of that, the Americans have on the clocks in the airport, God bless the military. I mean, for fuck's sake, So those three countries, so you're asking us in Egypt, a country that has national service conscription, where every home has basically donated a son to the military, So you're talking about this incredible reverence to a military. And then you're asking a population that is unarmed to take on one of the most armed militaries in the world. I think the Egyptian military is the 10th strongest military in the world. And we're armed by who? By everyone. By the Americans, by the Russians, by you, by the Italians. How are we supposed to take this on? So when we're told, why has your revolution failed? You're asking the wrong question. Why do you continue to arm our dictators? Why do you continue to take the wrong side? Is really the question,
Is that what do you think, Syed? Do you think there can be a way forward? Obviously, we've talked about that it's 100 years since the protectorate. We've had 70 years since the revolution, as it were. We've seen the collapse, rebirth, etc. Various different machinations of what can go on in Egypt, but the military is still there. It's never really gone, apart from the little Morsi little period where you could argue they're probably still, the whole point, the reason why they're still there now is because they were still there then. Is there actually any way of this changing without something drastic happening?
I think if we were having this conversation in summer of 2010, we could have asked that question. We never would have been able to foresee or predict what happened in February or January 25th in 2011. I mean, that was something. But its causation happened outside Egypt. It happened in Tunisia with Mohamed Bouazizi immolating himself. I mean, that's a black swan. I mean, how do you possibly go ahead and you predict something like that? So I don't want to be pessimistic and to say that Sisi couldn't be out of the picture. I mean, there's COVID, there's monkeypox, he goes to East London, apparently polio again too. But the whole idea that it seems that the common denominator, though, that helps mitigate the possibility of maintaining the status quo is external forces maintaining the status quo. I mean, Sisi is in there by the charity of other neighbors, shall we say. I mean, the point that you made about Ataturk, I mean, I think it's important to remember, in 1922, the Ankara Assembly abolishes the Sultanate as the legitimate ruler representative of an authority of Turkey. And then he creates a paradigm where he commands the respect of the international community to leave Turkey alone, which then allows him to embark on this rather ambitious project of reforms. Of course, it costs the Muslim world the caliphate 2 years later as an institution based in Turkey. I don't think that we've seen Egypt really free of that kind of external force. I mean, after all, the 1950s was a period of removing two colonial powers, but bringing one back in, a neo-colonial power when it came to the Cold War. And the Cold War was a crucible for so many of these countries for so long. And then when that finally ended, it seemed as though there was a bit of a vacuum regarding these countries. But at the same time, the alignments that were there with, for example, the United States and Egypt were being retained under the guise of stability and security. Less so Egypt's security and stability than that of the United States and whatever its interests might have been. And now, of course, we see with Sisi, after the removal of Morsi, a shift in the center of gravity toward the Gulf states and them maintaining that. I don't know what were the Jenga pieces to unravel this yet. And maybe, again, as we saw with the example of the Arab Spring, it may come in one of the more improbable and unexpected areas.
Abdul Rahman, what do you think?
I think it's going to be interesting to see how next month the 52 anniversary is commemorated in Egypt. I think it's always symbolic. The one thing I'm struck by when I go back to Egypt is how my family, and I assume other families, are still paralyzed with this debate. We spend hours in our family, especially my sort of elder members, still debating Nasser, Sadat, Nasser. That debate we never seem to have moved on, and there seems to be like an intellectual paralysis in Egypt over that. I'm never quite sure why. Maybe it's because there is no freedom.
But these are big. I'm just a devil's advocate now. Maybe it's because it's very hard, even though I know all the caveats, it's still very hard for me to move away from that kind of hero worship that many people had of Nasser.
I don't think there's hero worship in Egypt now for
No,
Nasser. I
but
don't think there's. I think the Egyptians have moved on.
But what I mean is these are big characters, though. Aren't you allowed to have a debate about big characters?
Yes, but the debate that's happening in Egypt is not healthy because there's still a kind of internal paralysis. They seem to they go back, did Nasser do this, did that? All the Egyptian newspapers constantly on a daily basis, there's a reference to Mohamed Hassan Haikal, all the writers going back, and they don't seem to have moved forward, except I feel now there's an energy shift. And I don't think there's a hero worship in Nasser. I think Nasser has. He's brought up from time to time.
Less about the hero worship, more about the fact that because it's like Churchill in this country.
Well, I was going to raise that point.
Yeah.
I mean, Churchill's legacy is still being litigated today. I mean, Tariq Ali has a new biography about it, and it's gaining traction, and partly because of this revisitation about Britain's colonial legacy and how much of it should be lionized, pun intended. I think is always going to be there. I mean,
exactly,
I think it's a systemic
and that's
issue.
why I think isn't this the same thing, that you're always going to have a conversation about the likes of Nasser and Sadat, simply because they are huge beasts in the 20th century story of Egypt.
But I think as a corollary to that, it's that whether as a society you have the bandwidth to have that conversation along with other more pressing conversations.
Exactly,
And
What would
Britain
you say
might be
to
able
that
to
then?
do that.
I think they're having this conversation because they're not allowed to speak on other issues.
Exactly,
So they're living in the past. There's a kind of, they haven't moved on. I think Egypt is changing. I'm more optimistic about Egypt. Yes, I am. I do go a lot. I go back to Egypt quite frequently. I'm optimistic about the young of Egypt. I feel now there's an energy. There's a kind of leave the government. They can do what they want. We're no longer going to rely on the government. We're going to do it ourselves. Having said that, I feel that Egypt has socioeconomic problems, which are, I assume, like Pakistan, maybe even like Turkey. Look at the inflation in Turkey, the economic problems in Turkey. And I'm not quite sure what any one government can do to fix these problems. But I'm strangely and quite maybe naively more optimistic than I was a few years ago. Not because of the political situation, which remains as dire as it's always been, but because I sense that the young Egyptians, there's something brewing.
And Mona, are you as optimistic?
I am. I'm tenaciously optimistic. I mean, I was talking about my parents earlier, and my parents are not the young generation, but my parents are both pro-revolution. My parents absolutely detest Sisi. My dad goes on Facebook to argue with my cousins, about Sisi, because some of my cousins support Sisi. And my dad is like, "Are you insane? How can you support this fascist?" So my parents give me a lot of hope. My parents are very politically savvy and pro-revolution. So there are older Egyptians. I'm 54. I'm definitely pro-revolution, and having experienced the crimes of the regime on my personal body. And among my friends, I have friends who continue to be imprisoned by the Sisi regime, like Abdel Fattah, who is a revolutionary and an activist that many of you might already know, who was given British citizenship last year and who's been on hunger strike for more than 80 days now because of absolutely shit reasons. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever for him to still be in Sisi's prisons other than the fact that he is a really important and influential, much-loved revolutionary and activist. And they're ruining this man's life. He's 40 years old. I first met him when he was 25. He's a wonderful man. But I remain tenaciously optimistic because the Mexican-American, the Chicano activist Cesar Chavez once said something that I love, and that is social change is like teaching people to read and write. You can never unteach them to read and write. Once you become literate, you can't forget how to read and write. So something happened in the region that has influenced not just other countries that didn't have revolutions, but the entire world. Egypt was being invoked at Occupy Wall Street. Egypt has been invoked in so many. I know Tunisia started it, but Egypt has this hold on the global imagination. And not just because we're chauvinists as Egyptians and we think that we're really important and 7,000 years history and all that, but Egypt does have a place in the global imagination, and our revolution has been invoked. So this is what I like to think, that people in Egypt have seen something that they will never unsee. And that is the power of people saying no and the power of saying enough. And before, in 2010, maybe some people didn't see a revolution coming, perhaps less likely seeing Mubarak step down, but many of us did see something major coming because of that word enough, kifaya, because we had a movement called kifaya that began, a few years before the revolution and was staging unprecedented instances of saying no and enough in front of the Interior Ministry and in places where you would think it would never ever happen. So I'm tenaciously optimistic. I think our revolution will succeed. Revolutions do not succeed the first time around. There's cycles, like I said. But people have seen something they will never unsee. And we will rid ourselves of this constant dichotomy between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood, which for me are two sides of the same, basically tyrannical coin, with one obviously having more weapons than the other.
Well, inshallah, we'll see that day. Yeah, we'll see that day. It'll come. I think we've got some time for some questions from the audience.
I just wanted to ask: do you think there is a way to sort of for women to solidify and cement their place in the revolution in a way that they can't be backtracked?
Yes, I think there is. Look, I'm seeing with Sudanese women and Egyptian women and other women, Syrian women and other women, Yemeni, all the countries that have had revolutions, and to various degree of quote-unquote success, quote-unquote failure across the region. I think women this time around have been very savvy to the ways that we are historically dispossessed of revolution and any kind of achievements. In that I'm seeing, in Egypt, for example, we've seen so many women create groups that have pushed back against sexual violence, pushed back against intimate partner violence, things like assault police and other groups that I'm seeing among Sudanese as well, that demanded that women's testimonies of rape and sexual violence after the revolution be taken seriously. So I think that because of the connectivity of social media, because we watched each other's revolutions, because we watched what happened to women, I think women this time around, unlike earlier revolutions where we didn't have that connectivity of social media, are much more, again, savvy in what could happen. And they've been connecting with each other, they've been talking about feminism across the region, they've been seeing what each of them have achieved and what more that they can achieve. So, as I said, I'm tenaciously optimistic, and we're seeing the impacts of revolutions in real time. I'm sure that you're seeing in Sudan how it's impacting, various families. This, for me, is the achievement of the revolution, much more than what's happening up here. What's happening up here has nothing to do with people's real day-to-day life, unless you're an activist, which many people aren't, and you're in prison, and of course that impacts your life. But I'm talking about the day-to-day reality, where people's lives are changing.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to let Mona have the last word on that one now. I'm really sorry. It was very poorly chaired by me because I lost time. I was so engrossed in the conversation, I forgot to go to the audience earlier. So I'm afraid, because we've got the next session starts in 10 minutes, that has to be the end of this one. So I'd just like to thank our panel. It's been fascinating. Syed, Abdul Rahman, Mona, and for you as well. Thank you very much for joining in, and I'm sorry.